The first thing that hit Daniel when he stepped inside the Granville Cinema was the air. It was thick, heavy, like a place that hadn't been truly lived in for years. It carried the usual sense of a theater: stale buttered popcorn, spilled soda that had long since turned sticky, the faint hint of something burnt from the old projectors. But underneath it all, there was something else. Something foul, something rotting. The theater wasn't abandoned, but it felt like it should be. The lobby stretched out before him, empty and dimly lit by the flickering glow of old yellow bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The carpet was supposed to be red, but it had long since faded into a murky brown, stained and frayed from decades of footsteps that had come and gone. The walls were lined with movie posters, some torn at the edges, their corners curling. He squinted at them. Some of the films were classics, ones he recognized: Psycho, The Exorcist, Nosferatu. But others made his stomach twist. There was one for a movie he'd never heard of, The Hollow Ones. The image was simple, just a dark forest with two glowing eyes staring from the trees. There was another for a black and white film called They Watch from the Seats. The cast list was empty. No director, no credits, just a tagline in faded letters: "You've already seen them." Daniel looked away. His gut told him to turn around and leave, that this wasn't just some old rundown theater. It was something else. Something that had been sitting in the dark, waiting for someone like him to step inside. But Daniel needed the job. His landlord had already given him a final warning. If he didn't come up with rent by the end of the month, he'd be out on the street. The Granville was the only place that was hiring for a night shift, and as weird as the place felt, it was just a job. That's all. Then he saw him. The man standing behind the counter looked wrong. At first, Daniel thought he was a wax figure, something that had been left there and forgotten. He was thin, too thin, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. His skin was stretched tight over his face, pale to the point of almost being gray. His eyes were sunken, shadowed, and his lips barely moved when he finally spoke. "You're Carter?" His voice was dry, brittle, like crumpled paper. Daniel swallowed. "Yeah, here for the night shift." The man, Mr. Langley, the manager, didn't respond right away. He just stood there staring at Daniel as if sizing him up. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his posture that made Daniel's stomach clench. Langley moved slowly, reaching under the counter with thin, bony fingers. He pulled out a single piece of paper, crumpled, yellowed with age, and slid it across the desk without a word. Daniel hesitated before picking it up. The rules were handwritten, the ink faded and uneven, as if they'd been rewritten many times before. 1. Leave a full bucket of popcorn on seat B7 in Theater 4 before closing. 2. If the lights flicker in Theater 2, do not enter until they stop. 3. Never look at Screen 6 after midnight. 4. If you hear knocking at the front door after 3 a.m., do not answer. 5. If you see someone in a theater after closing, leave immediately. Do not acknowledge them. Daniel read the list again, then again. His stomach twisted. Some of them were weird. Popcorn on a specific seat? Don't go into Theater 2 if the lights flicker? Maybe it was just some old tradition, or maybe Langley was superstitious. But the others: never look at Screen 6 after midnight. Do not answer the door after 3 a.m. If you see someone after closing, leave immediately. His grip on the paper tightened. What the hell kind of job was this? He let out a nervous laugh, trying to play it off. "This is a joke, right?" Langley didn't laugh, didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned in slightly. Not much, but just enough for Daniel to notice, just enough for the air between them to feel colder. "Follow the rules, Daniel. No exceptions." His voice was quieter now, but not in a way that made it seem like a friendly warning. It was like he was telling him something absolute. Like if Daniel broke a single rule, he wouldn't just get fired. Something worse would happen. Daniel's fingers felt clammy as he folded the paper and stuffed it into his pocket. He told himself this was just some kind of initiation ritual. Maybe Langley just liked messing with the new guy. But the way the old man was looking at him, staring through him, Daniel wasn't so sure. Langley reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single rusted key. It looked ancient, the kind you'd expect to see in a haunted mansion, not a movie theater. He placed it in Daniel's hand without another word. Daniel shivered. The key was ice cold. Langley stepped back, turned, and walked toward the front doors. His movements were slow, stiff, like his bones were resisting him. Then, without hesitation, he walked outside. Click! The lock snapped shut behind him. Daniel was alone. The silence pressed against him, thick and heavy. The lobby felt bigger now, the shadows stretching wider. Then, the lights flickered. Daniel's breath hitched, his heart pounded. The first rule on the list burned into his mind like a brand. If the lights flicker in Theater 2, do not enter until they stop. He wasn't in Theater 2, but somehow standing in the dim, empty lobby, he felt like something was watching him anyway. The job had just started, and already something felt very, very wrong. Daniel stood frozen in the empty lobby, his breath shallow. He glanced toward the hallway leading to the screening rooms. The darkness stretched deep, the kind that felt thicker than it should be, like the shadows had weight. Get a grip. It's just an old theater. Old wiring, old everything. Flickering lights weren't some supernatural warning. He forced himself to move, heading toward the break room near the concession stand. But as he walked, he noticed something. It was too quiet. There should have been some kind of sound, the hum of a vending machine, the faint buzzing of a light, maybe even the distant hum of cars outside. But there was nothing. Dead silence. Daniel swallowed. His footsteps sounded too loud against the faded carpet. He passed by Theater 1, Theater 2, Theater 3. All their doors were closed. The small window on each one showed only darkness inside, empty, normal. Then he reached Theater 6. The door was open, just slightly. A thin sliver of pale light spilled into the hallway, a soft flickering glow. Daniel stopped. He hadn't opened any of the theaters yet. The place had been locked up tight when Langley left. He was the only one here, so why was the door open? A quiet, electric buzzing reached his ears. It was faint, but it sent a prickle up his spine, like the sound an old TV makes when it's on, but showing nothing but static. His hands clenched. Do not look at screen 6 after midnight. The rule came back to him, but it was still early in the shift, not midnight yet. Still, something told him he shouldn't go in, that he should just turn around, pretend he never saw it, and keep walking. But his feet didn't listen. Slowly, carefully, he pushed the door open a little more. The air inside was different, colder. The smell of old popcorn and stale upholstery filled his nose, but there was something else under it, something faint and wrong. The giant screen at the front of the theater was glowing white, covered in static. No movie was playing, just that strange, flickering noise. And then he saw him. A man sat in the middle row, perfectly still. Daniel's pulse jumped. What the hell? The man wore a black suit, perfectly pressed, like he'd just stepped out of a funeral. His posture was stiff, unnatural. His arms rested on the armrests, fingers curled in a way that reminded Daniel of a mannequin. Something about him was off. His skin looked too smooth. His hair was too perfectly combed, like he'd been placed there, not like a real person who had walked in and sat down. Daniel hesitated. Maybe he was just some weird guy who had snuck in earlier. Maybe Langley had forgotten to mention it. But that didn't make sense. Langley had locked up. Daniel forced his voice to come out steady. Sir? We're closed." The man didn't move. Daniel took a step closer. The static from the screen buzzed louder. "Sir?" The man moved. Not naturally, not like a person turning their head. It was too slow, too deliberate. His head tilted toward Daniel in a way that made his stomach twist. The movement wasn't jerky, wasn't smooth, it was wrong. Then Daniel saw his face, or rather what should have been a face. The features weren't there. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. Daniel's body locked up. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but he couldn't. His breathing came in quick, shallow gasps. Then, the static on the screen shifted. Daniel's eyes flicked to it. At first, it was just more flickering white noise. Then the image warped. The fuzz twisted, forming a shape, a figure. Something was rising from the seat behind the faceless man. Daniel's stomach turned. The figure on the screen had too many limbs. Its arms were too long, too thin, bent at unnatural angles. It moved like it was unfolding itself, stretching, waking up. Daniel's whole body snapped into fight or flight mode. His legs finally worked. He ran! The door was too far. He swore it had been closer, but now it felt like the theater had stretched, pulling him deeper inside. Behind him, the static changed. The buzzing turned to something else, a whispering sound, faint but sharp. The seats beside him felt too full now, like there were people sitting in them. But he didn't dare look. He reached the door, shoved it open. Slammed, it shut behind him. His chest heaved, his back pressed against the door, fingers trembling. Silence. His ears rang, his heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then, from inside the theater, a single creaking sound, like someone standing up. Daniel bolted down the hall. He didn't stop running until he was back in the lobby. His hands were shaking violently, his lungs burned. The rules. He had followed them, right? It wasn't midnight yet. So what the hell did he just see? Daniel's thoughts were spiraling, trying to make sense of it, when knock, knock, knock. His breath stopped. It came from the front doors. The theater was locked. No one should be outside. He turned slowly. Through the glass, the dark parking lot stretched empty, but then another knock. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Because this time, it didn't come from the front door. It came from the side entrance. Someone was inside the building. Daniel's hands were still shaking. His pulse pounded in his ears. His breathing was fast, shallow, like he couldn't get enough air. His phone screen glowed in the dark lobby. He forced himself to look at it. He had 5 more hours until his shift was over. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. It echoed through the empty theater, cutting through the silence like a blade. Daniel's skin crawled. The front doors were locked. No one should be able to get in. His legs felt stiff as he turned toward the glass entrance. The parking lot outside was dim, barely lit by a few streetlights. It looked wrong. Too still, too empty. Then a voice. "Hey, I left my phone inside. Can you let me in?" Daniel froze. The voice was casual, almost bored, like some guy who'd forgotten his phone after a late-night movie. But something was off. He could barely see anyone outside. The streetlights didn't reach the entrance completely, and the shadows were thick. He swallowed hard. His fingers felt numb as he reached for the security camera monitor on the counter. The black and white screen flickered to life. His stomach twisted. The entrance was empty. There was no one there. But the knocking came again, harder. "Hey man, it's cold out here." The voice had changed, lower, strained, like something was pushing the words out through gritted teeth. Daniel's breath hitched, his whole body tensed. The knocking didn't stop, louder, more forceful. Like it knew he was hesitating, like it was getting impatient. Then, the voice changed again. Daniel's body went rigid, because now the voice sounded exactly like him. "Daniel, let me in." His stomach dropped, his own voice coming from outside. Daniel stumbled back, his legs hitting the counter. His hands clenched the edge. "Let me in." The voice was calm now, almost soft, like it was smiling. Daniel's breath came fast and uneven. His skin felt cold, like he'd been dropped into ice water. His eyes darted to the security screen again. Still nothing. No shadow, no movement, just the empty parking lot. But the knocking hadn't stopped. "Daniel, you don't want to be alone in there." His chest tightened. His hands felt clammy, sweat pooling in his palms. He forced his voice out. It barely came as a whisper. "Go away." Silence. The knocking stopped. The air felt heavier. His ears rang from the sudden absence of sound. Then, a faint tap, right behind him. Daniel's whole body snapped around. Nothing. The lobby was empty. The doors leading to the screening rooms stood dark and still. The hallways stretched into blackness. But he could feel it. Something was here, watching, waiting. His breath hitched. His knees felt locked in place. Then, just barely, a flicker of movement. From theater, Daniel's stomach twisted into a knot. The door was open again. A sliver of pale light spilled into the hallway. And from inside, the screen was playing something. Something he hadn't started. Daniel didn't want to move, didn't want to see what was on that screen, but his body was already walking toward it. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to run, to not go inside that theater. But his feet kept moving. One slow step, then another. A pale strip of flickering light spilled out from the half-open door of Theater 6, stretching across the dark carpet like a skeletal hand. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old popcorn butter, damp fabric, and something faintly metallic. The buzzing from the screen hummed softly, crawling into his ears like tiny insects. Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. He hadn't turned on any film. He hadn't even been near the projector rooms. And yet, something was playing. His fingers trembled as he reached for the door, pushing it open just enough to peek inside. The hinges groaned, the sound splitting through the thick silence like a dying breath. The screen flickered, pulsing with dim, uneven light. Daniel's stomach knotted. It wasn't a movie. The image on the screen was black and white security footage. The theater lobby. His theater lobby, right now. Daniel's breath hitched. His own reflection stood in the center of the frame, caught in the grainy feed. It was him, but something felt off. His heart pounded as he took a step closer, eyes locked on the screen. His reflection moved before he did. It stepped forward before his own foot even left the ground. Daniel's breath came shallow and uneven. His hands shook at his sides. No, that wasn't possible. The security feed wasn't showing a recording. It was showing something else. Something wrong. Daniel's fingers twitched. The version of him on the screen didn't move. Then, it blinked. Daniel didn't. Ice spread through his chest. That wasn't him. The screen crackled, the static hissing louder. His legs begged him to run, but his body wouldn't move. He was stuck. A whisper brushed against his ear. Soft. Close. Keep watching. Daniel jerked around. No one. The theater was empty. The rows of seats stretched into darkness, silent and still. His pulse hammered in his skull. The whisper had been right there. Someone had been standing beside him, his fingers clenched into fists. He needed to leave. He turned back to the screen. The footage had changed. It was no longer the lobby. It was Theater 6. His stomach dropped. It showed him, standing right here. His whole body stiffened. The camera angle was from behind, like someone was filming him right now from the back of the theater. Daniel's throat closed. He didn't want to look. But his head moved anyway. He turned. Nothing. Only darkness between the rows of seats. But the screen, the camera was moving. Something was walking toward him in the film. From the very last row of seats, Daniel couldn't breathe. His hands shook violently. He stumbled back, his sneakers scuffing against the sticky floor. The camera kept moving, getting closer. Daniel's chest tightened. His ribs felt like they were caving in. His body screamed at him to run. The screen flickered again. A figure stepped into the frame. Daniel bolted. He spun and sprinted for the exit, his shoes slamming against the floor. His shoulder crashed against the door as he shoved it open, nearly falling into the hallway. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. His hands trembled uncontrollably. But behind him, the static kept hissing. And deep within the static, there was laughter. Low, amused, and very, very close. Daniel didn't stop running. His legs burned. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't care. He had to get away. The static still hissed behind him, that horrible laughter buried deep within it, like it was lodged in his skull. It wasn't normal laughter. It wasn't human. It was something else. He sprinted past the empty theater halls, past the dim concession stand, and shoved open the break room door so hard it slammed against the wall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and there, sitting at the tiny plastic table, was Ralph. The old janitor, dressed in his usual faded coveralls, sat hunched over a sandwich, chewing slowly. He didn't even flinch when Daniel burst in, chest heaving, eyes wide with panic. Ralph just sighed, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and said, "You saw something, didn't you?" Daniel's stomach lurched. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His body was still in fight or flight mode. Muscles tensed, brain screaming at him to keep moving. Ralph took another bite of his sandwich. "Sit down before you pass out." Daniel collapsed into a chair, his hands still shaking. For a long moment, the only sound was the buzzing lights and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Then Ralph sighed again, setting his sandwich down. "You know about the projectionist, right?" Daniel forced himself to swallow. "What?" Ralph leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded like he was too tired to care. "The guy who used to work here, years ago, just disappeared one night. Poof, gone. No body, no clues, nothing." Daniel's throat was dry. Ralph scratched his chin. After that, weird stuff started happening. Security footage picked up things. Daniel's skin prickled. "What kind of things?" Ralph stared at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Crawling." Daniel's stomach twisted. Ralph nodded slowly. "The cameras caught something moving through the vents. It was fast, and it was wrong. Too many elbows, too many knees, not enough bones." Daniel's heart pounded so hard it hurt, and then a sound. Above them. A soft, wet, creaking noise. Both of them froze. Ralph's expression darkened. He slowly, carefully, set his sandwich down. Daniel's breath hitched. The noise came again, a shifting, a scraping, a slow, deliberate movement. Right above them, the air in the room felt too thick. The buzzing lights flickered. Daniel's eyes drifted upward. The ceiling vent. Something was in there, and it was watching them. Daniel and Ralph sat completely still. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a hand slipped through the vent slats. Daniel choked back a scream. The fingers were too long, too thin. The skin was grayish, leathery, the nails curled and jagged. It gripped the edges of the vent, pulling downward slightly, like testing the weight. Then, a second hand. Then, a face. Daniel's stomach turned inside out. The thing peered through the slats, its head tilting unnaturally. Its eyes were wide and bulging, lidless and too shiny. Its mouth was slightly open, showing rows of small, sharp teeth. Daniel couldn't breathe. Then, the vent cover buckled. The metal groaned as the thing pressed against it, pushing its face through the gaps. Its jaw unhinged. And then it spoke. A voice like wet paper tearing. "You're not supposed to be here." Daniel's body finally remembered how to move. He screamed. The thing lunged. Daniel bolted for the door. Behind him, the vent ripped open. Something hit the floor. Hard. Daniel didn't look back. He just ran. His feet pounded against the floor, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but none of it mattered. He just had to get away. The halls blurred past him, the dim lights flickering overhead. The sound of something following him echoed behind, skittering, crawling, too fast. Daniel swerved into the first open door he saw, Theater 4. He stumbled inside, chest heaving, gripping the wall to keep from falling. His whole body trembled, his ears straining for any sign of movement. Silence. Too silent. Daniel blinked. Something was wrong. The theater wasn't empty. Every single seat was filled. Rows and rows of shadowy figures sat perfectly still, their faces featureless, their bodies dark silhouettes. They were all staring straight ahead, unmoving. Daniel's stomach knotted. Slowly, he followed their gaze. The massive theater screen was glowing, and on it, Daniel saw himself. It was a live feed. The screen showed him, standing in Theater 4, looking at the screen. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The camera angle was impossible. It was being filmed from right behind him. His body went ice cold. His eyes darted around. He was alone. No camera, no one holding a phone, nothing. But on the screen, something moved behind him. A dark blur, a shape, shifting, crawling just outside his vision. Daniel's pulse hammered. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head. Nothing. His throat tightened. But on the screen, the shape was getting closer. Daniel spun around. Still nothing. His heartbeat was so loud he could barely think. Then, a sound. The soft creak of a chair. Daniel's stomach dropped. One of the figures had moved. In the audience, a shadowy shape was no longer facing the screen. It was looking at him. Daniel froze. Then another creak. Another figure turned its head. Then another. And another. Row by row, heads twisted toward him. Daniel's breath hitched. Then, slowly, one of them stood up. A second figure rose from its seat. A third. More and more, standing, staring. Daniel's legs locked in place. His body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. And then, the doors slammed shut. Daniel whirled around. The exit doors were sealed. A whisper brushed against his ear. "You're part of the film now." Daniel's blood ran cold. On the screen, his own reflection smiled. But Daniel? He hadn't moved. His breath hitched in his throat. His own reflection on the screen was grinning. But his real face? Frozen in terror. The theater felt wrong. The air was heavy, suffocating, like the whole building was breathing around him. The whisper still echoed in his ears. "You're part of the film now." No, he wasn't. Daniel spun toward the exit doors and threw his weight against them. They didn't budge. His heartbeat thundered. He grabbed the handle, yanking, twisting. Nothing. The shadows in the audience shifted. Figures tilted their heads. A low, wet, creaking noise filled the air. They were getting closer. Daniel's stomach twisted. Move, move, move. His feet finally obeyed. He bolted up the aisle, nearly tripping over the seats. The walls of the theater seemed to stretch, the exit farther than before. Something moved behind him, a rustle of fabric, a footstep, then another. Daniel burst through the side door, stumbling into the hallway. He didn't stop, didn't look back. He ran. The break room was too open. The storage rooms were too dark. The office, that was his only shot. He sprinted down the hall, lungs burning. His shoulder slammed against the office door, fingers scrambling for the lock. He pushed inside and shut it fast. His hands were shaking as he grabbed the phone. dialed the number. Ring, ring, click. Langley's gravelly voice crackled through. "You broke too many rules, kid." Daniel's blood turned to ice. His grip on the phone tightened. "What?" he whispered. The radio hissed. Langley exhaled, slow. "I told you to follow the rules. You didn't listen." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. I tried." A sharp electric buzz cut through the line. Daniel turned to the security monitors. His heart stopped. The cameras showed the entrance. Someone was standing there. It was Daniel. Standing at the front doors, staring inside. His stomach churned. But he was still in the office. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, the mouse. The cameras glitched. The Daniel on screen twitched. Then his head turned. Not toward the theater, toward the camera, toward him. Daniel's chest clenched. His own face on the screen was blank, expressionless. Then, the screen flickered. A message appeared. "Your shift is over." Daniel's breath caught. The screen glitched again. The camera switched to the lobby. Daniel saw him, the faceless man, standing by the concession stand, still, watching. Daniel swallowed hard. "No!" He grabbed the door handle, yanked it open. The hallway was wrong, too long, too dark, like the building itself had changed. Daniel ran anyway. His sneakers slapped against the tile. His lungs burned, his vision blurred. He just had to make it to the exit. But as he turned the last corner, the lobby was gone. The hallway just kept going. Daniel skidded to a stop. His chest heaved. He turned. The hallway behind him was gone too. Only darkness. Only the sound of footsteps. Getting closer. And closer. Daniel's hands curled into fists. He wasn't part of the film. He wasn't part of this. But the theater? It disagreed. The next morning, everything looked normal. The lobby was clean. The floors polished. The smell of popcorn lingered in the air. The neon sign outside flickered faintly, humming in the quiet morning. No sign of what had happened. No sign of Daniel. The front doors swung open. A young man stepped inside. Maybe 19, 20 years old. He looked excited, nervous, but eager. His name tag was still shiny and new. A voice grumbled behind him. "You're late." The new employee jumped and turned. Mr. Langley stood by the counter, arms crossed. His tired eyes scanned the kid up and down. He sighed and reached under the counter. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, a list of rules. The kid took it, brows furrowing. What's this?" Langley exhaled. "Your rules." The new employee squinted at the list. He chuckled. "Some of these are kinda weird." Langley didn't laugh. His eyes flicked to the security monitors. The screens glitched for a second. Static buzzed. Then, a figure appeared, deep in the theater halls, standing completely still, watching, silent. The camera feed flickered, but the figure, it didn't disappear. It didn't disappear. Langley's jaw tightened. He looked back at the kid. "Just follow them." "Yeah, okay." Langley sighed, rubbing his temples. The cycle began again.